Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go get ahead and get started in just a minute or so once we give everybody a chance to come in from the waiting room. All right, we'll get started in about 30 seconds. Chris, do you want to go ahead and kick things off?
Great. Thanks, Maggie. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this very important discussion about climate equity. And thank you to Samantha, Auden, Molly, and Jason for your valuable insights. I am Chris Steinkamp, the head of advocacy at SIA. And before I hand it over to Jason Swann from Western Resource Advocates to lead the conversation, just a quick reminder that we want to answer all your questions, and we're going to leave plenty of time at the end of our discussion. So please post your questions in the Q&A bar or the section in the toolbar, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have. But again, we're going to leave plenty of time at the end of this for your questions, and we hope that you'll have some. So thank you again for being here today, and let's just get started. So all right, Jason, why don't you just take it away?
Hey, thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to be here. You know, the planet is in peril due to catastrophic climate change. The effects of a dying planet are and will continue to affect every living thing on Earth. Those who are most impacted by climate change are those who are socially and economically and usually racially oppressed. A climate gap that will only continue to grow in the coming decades without active intervention. But why should you care? Those who have access to mobility and places with healthier resources are feeling less, if even none, of the immediate impact of climate change. If you are upheld by a system that has benefited you, why should you bother trying to dismantle it? When the fire of climate change is in the distance and not at your feet, why does it behoove you, your family, your business to take action now? My name is Jason Swann, land policy analyst at Western Resource Advocates, founder of Rising Routes, Colorado outdoor Afro leader, lover of all things Colorado, and your moderator for today's discussion. Today, we take a closer look at climate equity, its impacts, and why you, your business, should care. Today, I share the stage with Samantha Harris, Associate Director of Climate, Global Lead, and Climate Justice for the Business for Social Responsibility. Molly Kawahata, former Obama White House Energy and Climate Advisor, and Auden Schindler, Senior Vice President for Sustainability at Aspen Skiing Company. Take your mics off and mute, say hello, say good morning. It's good to see you all. It's good to be here with you. It's a pleasure.
Likewise.
Hi, everyone.
For having us.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. Now, I'm gonna jump right into it because, we got a lot to discuss. We got a little time. You know how quick these things go. And I want to make sure that we answer all the questions, not only that we have presented here, but also the questions that we can get from our audience. So this idea of climate equity, and Molly, Samantha, maybe I'll start with you, and then we could share around, but this idea of climate equity, it's been coined. So many people have used the word equity, right? This idea of sharing power and things as such, and it has many, many different shapes and forms, from climate justice to environmental justice, you hear, right? This intersection of climate change and people. How would this panel, from your own perspectives, from the work that you do, define this idea of climate equity?
Sure. Yeah, happy to kick it off. I think so for the purpose of this discussion and just the purpose of my work coming from working with businesses on climate and climate equity and climate justice, we're really looking at helping businesses understand those terms and understand the differences between them. If we're looking at sort of inequality and equality issues, really looking at like the unequal access, that's really just looking at like maybe there are lots of resources out there, and they're distributed, but maybe certain people can't access them. So when we talk about equity, that's really thinking about like those custom tools or those interventions that can be made to help people that can't access them. So for the purpose of climate equity, maybe this is looking at specific populations that are disproportionately affected by some of the impacts we see from climate change. So whether we're looking at physical impacts of climate change like sea level rise or hurricanes, droughts, of the fires that we're seeing in the West, what that looks like. We're looking at, if we're looking at equity tools, we're looking at tools that are created for those populations that are going to be affected the most. And so in the US, this does happen to be where we're looking at race is the salient factor. So people of color, the communities of color, as well as low income populations. And then if we're looking at climate justice, when we say justice, we're really looking at the actions that would need to be taken to sort of dismantle or fix the problem itself. So we're not necessarily thinking about creating tools for specific people, we're actually fixing the problem. So the problem doesn't exist and you therefore don't need to create tools or solutions specific to specific groups. So I think that's like one way when we're trying to explain, you know, what do we mean by climate equity versus climate justice? It's really thinking through like, okay, climate equity is maybe you're thinking about creating some specific solutions for specific groups that definitely need them. So these tend to be around access issues, access to resources to be able to either prepare for or respond to a climate impact, or thinking through the solutions that we're putting forward, like renewable energy, for example, and how can we put renewable energy and give access to renewable energy in communities that may be situated closest to fossil fuel plants, for example, or other kinds of environmental pollution. Again, justice is when we start really getting into those, like thinking through revamping policies, for example, to include some of these equity issues, include programs to prevent these things from happening, to prevent pollution from happening in the first place, and really tackle some of these systemic injustices, I guess. So I don't know if that helps sort of think through it. We also think like we get questions around like environmental and climate justice, like what's the difference? I mean, the NAACP has an amazing definition for this on their webpage. I recommend taking a look at it, but we really situate our work within that. And environmental justice is sort of the big bucket of what this looks like, and climate justice really fits within that. So when we're thinking about taking action on climate and making sure that those most affected by the climate crisis are protected, that really situates within a much larger conversation and action that needs to be done around environmental justice, which takes into account some of these other like pollution factors, transportation corridors that might be, larger, they have larger pollution areas. So water pollution, for example. So it's definitely like, they're different, but they're definitely connected. And I would say climate justice would sort of be a part of that larger environmental justice topic, especially in the US. So let me stop there. Hopefully that explains some of the tricky nuances.
It does. It really gives us some framework to go on. Auden, I'm really curious. I know that you've written, in the Harvard Business Review. You know, this is a subject matter expert. You're a subject matter expert in this. You've done a lot of work in this. How do you see your definition of climate equity from your perspective and the work that you do?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna spin off that question a little, Jason. You know, I think the essential question is why care? You posited this early on, and you know, in the snow sports industry and the outdoor industry, and really business in general, we leadership have established that you've got to solve climate change if you hope to achieve sustainability. And the problem has been that the climate movement has historically been the environmental movement, which is too small. Starting in 2014 in the climate march in New York City, if you looked around, and I did this, I was like, who are these people? This isn't the traditional environmental movement. There is a huge equity component to it. And so if you care about climate change, you have to include the equity movement, because otherwise it's not a big enough movement. That's point one. Point two is, why wouldn't you? Because all the people who are working on justice and equity, racial justice, Black Lives Matter, they're all on your side, right? The things they care about are about human dignity in the same way that climate is. So there's this existential reason to care, but then secondarily, it's not clear to me that you can be a relevant business in the modern world, especially with millennial clients, without a position on the most pressing issues of our time, which are now justice and climate, and they're the same thing. So look at organizations like the NBA that has been absolutely remarkable in how it's addressed Black Lives Matter specifically, and customers support that, but they're catering to their employees in the NBA, right? And their customers. Same with us. You know, we have had decades of a very strong position on gay rights because those are our customers and our employees, and it's a moral issue. I want to make just one overreaching observational point before I shut up, and it's that something has changed in the American understanding of these issues in the last year, and what changed in part was George Floyd's killing. And what happened when Floyd was filmed being killed by Derek Chauvin is that Chauvin was looking directly into the camera. And what he was saying, and this is what the white audience learned that they had not learned before, he was saying, I can do this with impunity. And what white Americans realized was that this isn't a bad cop. This is a systemic problem. And on climate, the same realization is occurring, which is that this isn't about my business. This isn't about your Prius. This is about a structure that was put in place by the fossil fuel industry and some of the same forces that created racial oppression in society. So this is an obvious opportunity to work together. I think George Floyd is a profoundly important metaphor for us, and has changed the conversation, obviously on race, but also on climate as a systemic problem.
These issues are systemic, and they've been very rooted for a very long time in the fabric of our Constitution and continue to be played out in so many other systems throughout this country. And so I really do resonate with that, because those are the things that we need to root out. This is one of the reasons why I got in policy, is that I knew that I could make a difference in that regard, at least on the legislative side. Molly, I'm curious what your thoughts are in regards to Auden's comments, because it really, that resonated with me, and I'm sure that we've talked about this before, that your company has a role in climate actions and focus on what matters. And why is it imperative that we move beyond doing things that have been largely ineffective, to Auden's point, but yet still trying to wield our corporate power more effectively, and fixing equity? It seems to be one of the issues that we're trying to do.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And Auden and Jason, I'm so glad we're talking about systemic change. That's everything I stand for and I'm working on. So here's what I'm going to say. If you are a small business and you are considering how to afford tens of thousands of dollars to measure your carbon footprint, to measure your scope 3 emissions, I am a climate professional who is going to tell you to stop. I don't care what your carbon footprint is.
Amen, girlfriend.
Here's why. This is really important. So actually, a lot of people don't know the story. In the year 2004, BP hired a massive PR company called Ogilvy & Mather, and they did a huge $250 million campaign to talk about and popularize the idea of an individual carbon footprint. I cannot make this more clear. The idea of a carbon footprint is a sham, it is a lie, and it is fossil fuel propaganda. What happened when we did this? Environmentalists, we took that torch and ran with it. We started creating our own carbon footprint calculators online. We told each other we should take this. And what happened is the focus came away from oil and gas companies, fossil fuels, which, by the way, are obviously the cause of climate change. We can look at the numbers. 1/3 of our emissions come from transportation, 1/3 come from electricity, and 1/3 come from industry. What are those? What do those have in common? fossil fuels. So when you do your carbon footprint, it is blaming you, it is blaming me, the end users who are forced to use a broken system for that system. And I'm going to give you an example. If I turn my lights on at night, am I polluting? A carbon footprint person would tell me yes. When you do the same, they will tell you yes. And when you say, what is the solution here? What can I do? They say, maybe just like don't use as much electricity. Now, is that a real solution? So I can now sit in my sad, dark house. Your business can turn off your lights. And the question becomes, what happened to that electricity grid? Absolutely nothing. This is the power of this fossil fuel propaganda. It is the smartest, most brilliant PR campaign in history. And we need to not only perpetuate this, we need to stop perpetuating it. We need to actively fight against it. Now, what can we do instead? Here's the beauty of it. It's way cheaper and it's way easier. Fighting for systemic change. And like, Jason, this is part of your daily life. This is something we can do that is so feasible. And what's so much more powerful is for small businesses, companies with your platform to use your platform to advocate for systemic change. That is lobbying, it is supporting policies, and it is activating your base. And I know there's a lot of like discomfort around this, but you can look at the organizations and the companies that Autumn mentioned. Look at Nike, which is a massive corporation with a massively diverse base of consumers. They took a stand on Black Lives Matter, on endorsing Colin Kaepernick, and that had a net positive benefit for them. Look at Patagonia, a company which comes off more than any other, like it just does not care what its detractors are going to say, and that is a net positive for them. That is part of their brand. Consumers do not like companies that sit on the sidelines anymore. And popular opinion is moving steadily towards supporting, not just believing in climate change, which is no longer a thing. You know, climate deniers, they're no longer a thing. It's a tiny minority. They're loud. They're not even like a percentage. What we're really talking about are consumers who want action on climate change. That is where your consumer base is moving, especially in the outdoor industry, and you need to cater to that. That is going to be not only something people like, but an expectation. And I'd encourage you, if you'd like to learn about environmental justice, which is another thing I'd love to talk about, Patagonia actually has a whole site they did on environmental justice, which focuses on public health. And if we are throwing around the term climate justice, environmental justice, just transition, and we are not talking about public health, it is BS. And let me explain to you why. At the White House, we went on a journey to understand the most effective way we can talk about climate change. And we tested everything from the national security frame, which is climate change makes you less safe, natural disasters, FEMA response, flood standards. We tested the economic frame for every decade we don't act on climate change, it's going to cost our economy this much. We tested the environmental frame. And this is what people understand climate change as an issue. Like polar bears in the Arctic, endangered species, glaciers melting. The average person doesn't have the luxury of caring about things happening thousands and thousands of miles away. When we focus on this, we keep the movement small. We keep it shrunk. What we found was by far unequivocally the most effective way to talk about climate change with the American people is through the lens of public health. This is why the movement has gained steam. It's because we're meeting more folks where they are. And this is where climate change becomes climate justice, becomes climate equity, becomes environmental justice. This is the intersection. So communities of color are significantly likelier to have to live near things like coal-fired power plants, polluting highways, and toxic waste sites. The NAACP has done incredible research in this space, and these are communities that this is not a surprise to them. They've been fighting for clean air and clean water for their children for decades, long before climate change was a term, long before Al Gore made a film. We haven't given them a seat at the table, and they built the table. So when we're talking about climate equity and we're not talking about public health, something is inherently missing. And this is the beauty of this. It transcends politics. For companies that are scared to, get in what they are scared of is the political fray, which climate change is not a political issue in any way. Well, when you talk about public health and you basically say pollution is a synonym for climate change, which it is, then you are now inherently including everybody and you are helping us expand the movement. And that's what we need to be doing. And if folks have trouble kind of figuring out how to talk about this, I'm happy to talk to you offline because I know this is a hard thing to frame, but it's very important.
Very hard thing to frame. That's why we're here, is to make it a little easier for people to understand. Samantha, I want to stay on that because you wrote that the most recent COVID crisis and the racial justice movement have highlighted how crisis disproportionately affects certain populations. And I know Molly was kind of speaking towards that and the urgency of now, is underscored by the climate crisis and the need for climate justice. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, Molly's a tough act to follow. No, I mean, honestly, I feel like I just learned so much. No, I think, yeah, what we've seen over the last like year and a half, like it hasn't been like already a year and a half, we've seen the pandemic and how it disproportionately affects certain populations. And it's very clear. We have data. We had data before, but this was data that was like very clearly sort of obvious to everyone. It also, like, the pandemic affected everyone. And so I think people paid attention a little bit more, so because they were going through it as well. I mean, and like Molly said, the environmental justice movement, it's been around for a very long time. This isn't new. And so we had data, but this was data that people paid attention to and are paying attention to. And so basically what we found out, we already knew this, but it very much just highlighted, it confirmed that these same populations are affected by other crises too. And so basically what it did is it gave a much bigger platform, or I guess a platform that people finally listened to, for action around tackling some of these the same injustices that people that affect people during a crisis like the pandemic, and the same as in a climate crisis, for example, or a climate impact, for example. So I think that that's just something to realize. And I mean, of course, again, it brings in that health issue as well, that public health issue. And really, I think that framing, I mean, Molly, you put it so beautifully, but that framing is just really what we're talking about when we're talking about the impacts, the climate impact on people. We're talking about their well-being, their health, their ability to have a livelihood, et cetera. So any way that we can frame that is going to help. I think the other thing is just that when we're looking at these solutions that we're putting forward for the climate crisis, and when we're looking at, like, people are putting strategies together up until 2050 and 2040, these are really long term. We know that some of these shifts are going to take a while. Yes, but I mean, the other thing is just that if we look at the potential devastation to any kind of progress that we're making on health, on poverty, on gender equality, things like that, the climate crisis really does have the potential to wipe that out. And if we don't solve the climate crisis, so there's also intergenerational equity issues, and we talk about like how this is affecting future populations, our youth right now, and what it means for them in 20, 30 years. So the equity piece is, there are so many different layers to that and so many different ways to look at this. If we look at how developed versus developing countries can take action on this or do anything about it, and how climate's already impacting different countries around the world. So there's really lots of different elements there. And I think, I mean, within the US, I mean, I feel like we've already sort of touched upon it, but really, yeah, I mean, race really is that salient factor, low income, and it is more than just, reducing emissions. It's about where people live. It's about the system that sort of generated these unfair situations for people, and no solution, and the solutions are not, embedded to fix that. So I think, like, when we talk about this, yes, I mean, reducing emissions for sure, all of that, yes, and renewable energy, but at the same time, this advocacy element is so crucial to this, as Molly just made very clear. And so, I mean, we also see, I was just going to say, like, we also see businesses where their employees, I mean, we've seen tons of employee letters come out over the last several years about to decision makers within, the business to do something on climate. But now we're starting to see it on environmental and climate justice. We actually just saw it with Amazon. Some of the employees, I think it was like hundreds of employees, got together and wrote a letter to their decision makers saying, it's really great you're doing stuff on climate, but are you looking at climate justice? Are you looking at environmental justice? Because they're throwing loads of money at climate, and they're not really tackling the core issue here and any of these systemic problems. So we're starting to see that pressure come from many different angles. Consumers, you mentioned, Molly. I mean, we see it from shareholders, we see it from employees themselves, and we see it just from the general community. So there's a lot of reasoning behind that, apart from just sort of like, it makes good sense to do something on this, but there's a lot of reasoning and to do this, and a lot of angles that we're seeing to really push that and make it something that you're going to have to do and pay attention to. So
Samantha, I'm curious because, and this question is for everyone, but it goes back to, Auden, you even mentioned this. It's like, why should businesses care that, if their constituents, if their employees, not even necessarily employees, but their consumer base is not overly concerned about this issue, right? And if and it doesn't affect them, at least right now. I mentioned in the beginning that sometimes the fire's in the distance. When it's not at your feet, you don't too much care about it. And I even look at people in my community right now who don't necessarily know much about climate change, are not really, educated about the issues, because again, like I think even Molly mentioned, we got other things to worry about. We're worried about food on the table, clean air, clean water. We want to make sure that, we're working full-time jobs and things like that. We all work full-time jobs, but we're very busy and don't have the time to devote to this climate. It almost feels like a privilege to be able to take the time off and devote to climate action. So I guess if you are a company, this is my question, I guess, Auden, if you are a company that has benefited from this system currently, you're doing well, you're making money, you're continually making money from the system. Why change now? Why make this complete shift away from your morals, perhaps, from your marketing scheme, from everything, to just do a 360 and become something completely that you're not used to ever doing? Is that detrimental, or is it like a golden opportunity for businesses to take?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the simplistically, we've been working on climate for 20 years, and now we realize, we haven't been that effective. And the reason is in part that we didn't have a big enough movement. So equity brings that in. But I think that understanding the climate issue and understanding equity as a sort of everything problem allows you to look at what you do through a different lens. And let me give you an example from resort communities and really any community. One of the huge challenges throughout the United States today is housing. And in Jackson and Aspen, but also in San Francisco and LA, there's huge demand for housing, but huge challenges around meeting that demand. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is urban planning policy that allows high density construction near mass transit hubs. Well, what happens when you propose that? It's opposed by the neighbors who say, not in my backyard. This is the same exact issue as Airbnbs. When an Airbnb in my neighborhood gets used, that's housing that's off the market. Our employees can't go there. We can't get in. And guess what? This is an equity issue and it's a climate issue. Because if you have housing on mass transit, you don't have as many people commuting. And if you have, reasonable, affordable housing nearer workplaces, it's a justice issue, right? Because in our town, where are the Latino workers commuting from? 50 miles away. So you start, like, the more that sessions like this or your own reading educate you in the integrated nature of race, of equity, of justice, and of climate, you start to say, oh my gosh, this is a direct effect on environment and business. We're at a point where we literally can't staff our restaurants or hotels because there's no housing. So when you create housing for workers, employees, it often ends up being not just a climate solution, but a justice and equity solution as well. And I'll end by saying we recently built a new affordable housing complex. It's entirely electric, which is a key climate solution. Jason, you should come visit it over here, and we'll drink beer too.
Yes.
And we moved a woman in to dedicated childcare housing, and she started crying when she got the unit, and she did because she had been commuting from an hour away every day, a single mom with 2 kids. This changed her life. Because she had 2 more hours a day, she could track her kids more effectively. And these are human questions. You know, this is about how we want to be as people and citizens. And by the way, it also bears directly on business.
Economic validity. It's what I'm hearing. It behooves everyone to be able to get on board and do what's right. Is the moral right thing to do. Molly, you mentioned, you know, I know a lot of work that you do is in climate communications. I'm really curious what your thoughts on that and how businesses can use that to improve their communications.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to piggyback really fast on
Yes,
what
please.
Auden and Sam were saying, because it's so spot on. So there are just two parts to this. If you're talking about your carbon footprint for your business, you are helping advance fossil fuel propaganda, and you are helping keep the climate movement small. You are basically, like, if you're looking at your supply chain, you're basically being one company that's apologizing for the fact that you are stuck in a system that is premised on transportation, that is premised on fossil fuels. You're like taking full responsibility for the fact that our entire sector is dirty. What's way more effective is if you talk about public health, listen, you can take skiers and you can say, fight climate change so you can keep skiing. Yes, I get that that appeals to a very small contingency that might be your consumer base. But if you start talking about public health, all of a sudden, you know, a lot of skiers reside in Utah, for example, and I have visited these Utah communities that are behind coal-fired power plants and cannot breathe. All of a sudden, these skiers say, whoa, this isn't just about my ability to keep skiing. This is about my ability to breathe. What could be more powerful than that? You will not only help the climate movement and do the right thing, you will expand your customer base when you talk about these things, because you're meeting more people where they are and you're saying you appeal to them in a way nobody else has. And you can lead on this. I think businesses can lead on this, including small businesses. The other thing I just want to reiterate, I guess those were the two things. Okay. And then getting into climate communications really quickly. And this is really important. So there was a psychological study done in the 80s where the researchers told the subjects to not think of a white bear. When they did this, all of the subjects thought about is a white bear. And it really showed that thought suppression is something that's very difficult. So when somebody uses an anti-climate narrative, for example, climate action hurts the economy, we hear this all the time. What progressives often do is that we respond to that narrative and we say, no climate action does not hurt the economy. And we'll even go so far as to say, act on climate because of XYZ. And when we do that, we're making the case for climate action. And we're actually saying, act on climate because it justifies the consequences. That's problematic because it's still wiring in people's brains, climate action and some sort of sacrifice or needing to strike some balance. So we're actually starting the debate in a very compromised position. What's way more effective is when we reframe the discussion. So again, if you talk about fighting climate change for the health and well-being of our children, of each other, whatever that is, all of a sudden balance and compromise is not part of the frame. You do not find balance in your health. You do not compromise on your health. You fight for it at all costs, especially for your children, right? You fight for it at all costs. This appeals to everybody. It is the least polarizing way to talk about this. And when we can do that, it's a way more effective way to talk about climate change because you're meeting more people where they are. So that's the power of reframing. A lot of this is based on the work of George Lakoff. It can be very complex to understand the nuances of framing. And the other part of this is when you talk about something within one frame, you're firing a web of neurons in that brain. And when you say it again, you're firing the exact same web of neurons and it actually gets stronger. And in neuroscience, we use the term neurons that fire together, wire together. You wire these things really strongly. So what's way more effective than saying one thing 10 different ways where you fire 10 different webs of neurons, which all have very weak connections, is when you say the same thing 10 times and make this that much stronger. So that's the power of reframing. And again, based on the work of George Lakoff at UC Berkeley, really powerful work and really, really helpful for brands to figure out how to talk about this. Again, Patagonia has a really great website that I'd encourage folks to check out about environmental justice using this brand new frame.
Very interesting. I'm about to check that out. I am curious because we have a little time here before we get to some questions, because I almost want to talk about the businesses that may even be on this call, right? The people that are here to see you all speak about climate equity. And we talked already about why they should care and why they should, employ equity and climate equity into their business strategies. What's at stake for these companies if they don't do it, if they ignore it? That I'm curious as to two parts to that. What's at stake if a business ignores this responsibility? But also, what are some suggestions that you think that they could implement to kind of step up their game in this regard?
Hey, Tom, I'm going to call you right back.
I could come in quickly on that if that's okay.
Yes, please.
I also just had a bit of a follow-up from what Auden was saying, which I really appreciated. He gave like a very clear example as to how like this relates to his business and his employees. And I think, so, you know, bear with me. A lot of the businesses I work with are the like Starbucks of the world, the Unilevers, really, really big multinationals with massive supply chains that reach globally across like all communities. And so, but that, I mean, it's what we find is that like, if that's the case, I mean, their supply chains, their operations are in communities that are being hit the hardest right now by climate change and will continue to be hit the hardest by climate change. And so they're in areas that are already sort of floodplains, or they're prone to big storm surges, or they're prone to wildfires, for example. So their businesses are across these areas, and really like, we see a very clear correlation about how employees, about how important communities are directly affected by this, and how that then directly affects the business. Auden, you gave a great example of that, but we see this in so many different ways. We see this with farmers on the ground. We see this with factory workers. We see this with hospitality workers. If you're not making sure or thinking about how your employees are affected by different crises, and what kind of systemic issues they already face, where they live, for example. I mean, Auden, you gave that example as to like, you know, communities that live super far away from work, and then they can't get to work, for example. I think that's really important to think about as a business. You need to think about what your business looks like. And sometimes we get, you know, I have conversations with companies where they think, I mean, it's less likely with the big companies because you know that you're going to have some, I mean, that there's going to be some impact, and that climate justice is definitely, you know, related to you. But we get the question of like, you know, this doesn't affect my business. This won't affect my employees. And that's just not true. I can guarantee you that every business has something there, and doing that, understanding that, learning from your employees, learning from your communities, and really trying to understand what those nuances might be is really, really important. And thinking that you might not have that in your either operations or your supply chain is just plain wrong. And I think, you know, Molly, you made it very clear too with the health connection. There's a connection there, and you need to understand what that looks like. And I can guarantee you that there's probably some connection there into how that will affect your bottom line. This doesn't necessarily need to be about your bottom line. And I think it probably is, whether you're talking about reputation or, I mean, this kind of goes into your questions, Jason, like what happens if you don't act? I mean, this definitely will, and we're already seeing it start to affect reputational issues, or there's a reputational risk there for not addressing this. And so whether we're talking about addressing your bottom line, it's probably going to impact that, and you should figure out what that looks like. And you should also know that, like, by not acting on this and the expectations around that we're seeing from these various communities, whether it's, you know, consumers or your employees or other stakeholders that are important, we're seeing the movement in the direction to act on this and to do something about this and to care about this and to do more than just talk about it. And so there's definitely a follow-up from the climate justice, environmental justice community that will happen if you speak about this, to want to see, what does this actually mean in action? What does this look like? It's great that you care about, and you're saying you care about environmental justice and that you think it's important that we act on this, but they're going to want to see follow-up, and they're going to want to know what you're doing. So I think, you know, be prepared to be held accountable for some of this, whether it's within your climate action that you're doing, or other ways that you can help boost the resilience of your various communities through some of these other areas, like providing access to health, access to housing, like you said, Auden. So it's really like this interconnection is definitely gaining momentum, or action around the intersection is gaining momentum. And we're seeing, I mean, some of the businesses that we see, so Starbucks, for example, has come out and talked about how they're they're going to be integrating this more into their supply chain resilience, and so into their supply chain communities. I think, you know, it's a big project, and it's a big scope of work. And so I think, you know, TBD on what exactly that will look like, but they've already started to do it within their renewable energy work as well, and how they're looking at developing renewable energy, making sure that renewable energy doesn't go into a community site, or like into a site with a community that lives there, for example, and also what that renewable energy supply chain looks like, and making sure that they're sourcing materials not from conflict zones, for example, or other areas that are sort of rich in human rights issues. So to get into some of the nuances there, but I think like really understanding that, doing the due diligence to understand what this looks like for your business, and partnering with the organizations and the people that have been doing this for years. They know people know where these things sit right now, and they can help you, and listening to them is really going to be crucial to this. So listening to those communities, listening to their representatives, and engaging them in this process to make sure you're developing things that actually are going to help them, and not what you think might help them. So I think those are just some of the elements that we're, you know, starting to talk to business about, and that we're seeing them do.
Anyone want to elaborate on that? I mean, I keep thinking about radical social responsibility as the word that keeps coming up to my mind right now. But any additional comments to what Samantha just discussed?
Yeah, I would love to jump off that. So here's something, like, with all of the outdoor companies that I've worked with, the number one emotion that comes out of this is fear. Is like a lot of fear around what people are going to think, what it means to take a stance, how that it's going to affect our bottom line. One, I don't think it's a really effective strategy to run a company based on fear, but it's also definitely not an effective way to take a stand. And people can sense this when companies put out these statements that are somewhere on the line and try to appeal to everybody and not really taking a real stance without real skin in the game. Consumers can sense that. It looks really weak. It looks really baseless. And it looks like they're being kind of lied to. What's way more effective is to actually take a stand, to get off the sidelines. And again, not only is that the right thing to do, it is trendy. People like it. Consumers support companies who are willing and able to do this. And leadership is a huge part of this. Again, our industry, there's a long way we have to go in actually fighting for equity and climate action in a real way. But what we're finding across the board is that there are very easy ways to do this. So for example, you could put out a statement, you can lobby, assign a lobbyist, you can activate your consumer base, you can advocate through your stores, whatever it is you do, it's actually very easy lift. And so I think it's something to have to take seriously, because even if you're a huge corporation or you're a small business, if there are a couple companies that are leading the industry in this, not only will you help change your industry, and you'll help provide space for other organizations and companies to get on board because they'll see it's the new standard, but you're actually going to also help us expand the climate movement. And what could be more rewarding than that? To use your platform for tremendous good.
Let me add that it's a sort of wide open opportunity for business, because the reality is nobody's doing it very effectively. Molly, you've brought up Patagonia, but who cares? They're Patagonia, they're the unicorn. The reality is very, very few companies, including Starbucks, have used power on climate and equity together. Apple, Facebook, Google, Amazon make big talk, and they're not spending more than 4% of lobbying dollars on action. There were two questions in the Q&A that I'm going to quickly respond to. One was about a website that allows you to look into how a corporation is doing and use your consumer influence. Well, what Molly's saying is that's almost complicity with the systemic problems we face. In other words, saying my individual actions, they're great. You should make good choices. But your individual action should be calling out the CEO of the company for not doing enough and asking them to lobby. It should be political action. So that's in part why I think that website's defunct, is that is less and less relevant. The second question was about B Corp certification. And B Corp was a great idea that was trying to change the corporate structure so that business could be a force for good in society. The problem with B Corp is that it capitulated almost entirely to the operational greening mode and barely initially emphasized power wielding and advocacy. Now there's some points to be had in B Corp certification by corporations that say, what are you doing on advocacy? But that's almost all that should matter. Yeah, you know, operational things like how you're dealing with waste and supply chain, that's good business. So there's a bullshit detector that's coming. It's not here yet, where customers are going to say, "Are you legit? Do you legitimately care about this?" Let me give you a quick example, and then I'll stop talking. Coke and Delta, I think it was Delta or Southwest in Georgia, they were involved in the conversations about those voter suppression laws, and they didn't oppose them until they were passed.
Right.
And once they were passed, they said, "Ooh, this is very bad." Well, that smelled really bad to the public because it looked like they got what they wanted, which was Republican governance and conservative lawmaking and repression. And then they came out and tried to get the imprimatur of goodness and morality for opposing it. Well, that's corruption. And you know, even though they got praise for those positions later, I think a lot of people said this is like flagrant corruption.
Molly.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely spot on. You have to have skin in the game. You have to do it in a real way because consumers are going to see that. Like Auden's now talking about that. He probably has nothing to do with Delta, but he's just like, that's BS. You can see that. And honestly, like, again, it's a wide open space, like Auden was saying, for a company, whether it's a corporation or a small business, to lead the industry. And it will benefit you tremendously. So I say, like, go for it. Like the space is open. It's really important that folks take this really seriously.
One
And,
note.
and I just want to, just really fast, I just want to say again, exactly like Auden was saying, when you're talking about your carbon footprint, when you're measuring your emissions, blah, 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 like you are not only responding to fossil fuel propaganda, you are helping advance it. And I believe it is a net negative on the industry. And if you're scared to take a stance, I get it. It can be scary and hard if that's not the premise in which your company is based. But ultimately, you can look at, for example, the Paris Climate Agreement. The biggest corporations in the world, including companies like Google, took a stand. They actually like signed on to letters. They were there. They took real action. And so it's really important that like if something's coming out and it matters to you, whether it matters to you in a direct way to your bottom line or your consumers are just going to care, people are going to notice.
Hey, Molly, will you please read my article that I posted in the chat? Because you're going to love it. Anyway, I share that for the whole group as well. But I don't know if I said this in this call because I've been on various calls this morning, but I think the place we're in is that there used to be business risk in taking a position on climate and equity. And I think now the risk is in not taking that position.
Spot on.
I agree with that for sure. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I answer this question daily too. So BSR also has members. We have members, and you can see them. They're again like these massive, multinationals. And we get that question all the time. Like, what's the risk if we say something about this? I mean, the risk is if you don't do anything, of course, right? Like, and so, but that's always a risk. That's always a risk. Greenwashing is a risk. You should never greenwash. That should just not be a thing. So that shouldn't be a thing that you think about doing. But if you're really wanting to do something on this, and you say something about this, the risk is, yeah, I mean, it's not there about acting on this. Like nobody, I don't think that, I think some companies are afraid that they might lose business, for example. I don't think so. No, we just haven't seen any. We haven't seen any real evidence that the amount of business that would be lost from a consumer that maybe sees that is going to be anything that's like going to help. We see it the other way. We see now where not doing something is really the business risk, like Auden said. And I mean, I think the other thing is just that, yeah, I mean, this is the communications part is definitely something that it's a different kind of communication than we've been seeing too. And talking about this is different. It's a more humble approach. It's something that acting around this, this intersection isn't necessarily something that we know how to do right off the bat, or that a business knows how to do. And I think that's okay. And I think saying that this is something that you think is important, you're going to start your journey to do this. Sorry for using the cliched word of using, of the journey, but it's true. And so I think like putting some honest effort into this and talking about it and being a part of that movement to drive this is only going to help your business, and it's only going to help your stakeholders are going to see that, and it's going to be a good thing. But doing it, full force, not part ways, like Molly was saying.
No more synonyms, no more metaphors, right? Just say it.
Right.
Just say it.
I will say that business this is an intelligence test, right? It's like, where do you think the world's headed, folks? Do you think that there's going to be less gay marriage, that we're going to less care about Black people's treatment in society, that we're going to have less legal pot? It's like all these trends are very clearly playing out. And yet when you do these things, you get in trouble. So let me give you an example. We made a statement on gay rights, which we've been doing for years. And we got a letter from a customer who spent $50,000 a year with us, which is no small deal, saying, I don't like what you're doing. I'm going to patronize more family-friendly resorts. Now, offensive as that is, as a business, that can't happen to us repeatedly, right? Because these are, frankly, it's our ability to run a business and have jobs. But if you look at that, you gotta believe that you're capturing guests and customers anew for everyone you're losing. And in terms of a brand, I'm not sure we want those guests at our resort, So you have to have some cojones as a leader in business to say, we're going to take this stand, and we're going to take this kind of scary result. But one of the things that when things are difficult and hard and you get in trouble for stuff, it means you're making progress and making change.
I think that's an important acknowledgement that Auden and Sam are both making, is like, you will have people that scream at you. But what's important to actually understand in the trends is that there's been this massive false equivalency between like pro climate action people and anti-climate action people, or deniers. The deniers are like the tiniest percentage of people in the country, that they're not even included in statistics anymore. The fact is, more largely, the Cato Institute has funded a lot of like thought leaders who are out there screaming about it. So the noise they make is disproportionately loud. Really so these people will scream at you at social media and they'll say a bunch of BS, whatever, ignore them, because the net gain, and I think the point is net, is going to be bigger. But ultimately, there's still people you're going to lose, like Auden is acknowledging. But again, it's like, screw them. Like, get more of your customer base and do the right thing and help your company.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I see our government, particularly here in Colorado, doing a lot of that, right? To the Outdoor Equity Grant Program, to the Outdoor Future Initiative, which is a federal initiative to get more underserved youth and children in the outdoors, so they can be obviously inherently connected to the land and the water and the air, but also want to protect it, and get more environmental education to these underserved communities as well, so they can be a little bit more educated about the things that are happening in and around their own neighborhood, so they can take action. So I'm very happy to see at least Colorado taking a stand on those issues. Samantha, I think you came off mute.
Yeah, I was just going to add that there are a lot of cities too, to take a lot of resources and plans coming out. So Oakland and Portland, for example, both have climate equity plans. They feature health dramatically throughout, which shouldn't be shocking given they're both cities. But and I think even, there have been a couple others recently that have come out. So there's a lot of movement around here. And I think, like, depending on where you're all situated, it's useful to look at like what your local community is doing on this and how it relates to you, and how you can also work with them. I mean, this is something that I should be very clear now. And if it's not, this is something very clear that it's not. It's something that's going to take a lot of partnerships and action. And so partnerships, how you can partner with your local community, your local government, what's already happening, get your governments to do stuff on this, whatever it looks like where you are. I think that's just, something to take a look at. And so those are just two examples. I put in the chat too that B Corp, Patagonia. I mean, Molly, you've already mentioned Patagonia has tons of resources on this, but they also put out a climate justice playbook for business, I think in February. And it's got some pretty good stuff in there. So useful to take a look at that and see sort of like some, it's got quite a lot of literature in there as to like the why you should care and how to act on that. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to add that might be useful for you all.
And I also, just real quickly, I wanted to mention also Denver has the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability and Resiliency through Proposition 2A last year. So that they are making moves in the city and county of Denver as well. So I'm really happy to be a part of that community. Molly?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, if you haven't done anything and you're just moving in one direction, or you want to change direction, again, you're like the Scope 3 emissions folks, and you're like, we want to change this, which would be great. Ultimately, like, there are a lot of resources available to you, because it's not easy. We get it's not easy to communicate climate and like harness the power of neuroscience and psychology to do that. Or like Sam is saying, like the steps you take economically, those are important. So recognize the resources available in the private sector and the public sector, like Jason is saying, to help you move in the direction you need to move.
Auditor, do you have any final words?
No, thank you, Jason. And I look forward to seeing you all around in this space.
How about you, Samantha?
No, I mean, I think this is great. I wish I could see you all and, you know, have actual conversations, but do reach out. I mean, if you do have questions, again, just like reach out to, I'm sure any of us, we'd be happy to point you in the direction to some of these materials if it's not obvious. And I guess just like, I don't know, don't be afraid to start the journey and to start the conversation. Don't be afraid to learn from the people that have been doing this forever. I mean, it should be a learning journey. You know, I've been working on this for a while. I would not say I know, you know, everything by any means. I'm still learning. This conversation, I learned stuff. So I think like really sort of changing that perspective of like, sometimes where businesses, you know, you think we have all the answers and then we need to get out there and give positions and tell everyone what to do. But at the same time, like, we just need to learn in this instance. We need to learn from the people that have been doing this. We need to learn from the communities that are affected and sort of, yeah, just find ways to bring it together, to work together. But happy to help anyone that's starting their journey and doesn't know what the next step is.
Hey, Chris, someone asked if you could post the resources that have been discussed here somewhere. So I'll let you figure that out, but maybe on the website.
Yeah, and feel free to include my email. Like Sam was saying, like feel free to reach out to us, because it is like so important, like that companies can not only help the climate movement, but lead it. And I think that's the power of the outdoor industry as well, is that in some ways we've kept our consumer bases really small and really privileged, and there's this huge opportunity to expand. So feel free to reach out to us so that we can help you in that. If you are kind of lost and you're like, what's the next step? The main thing I would say is like the space is wide open and it's ours for the taking. So like, go lead this effort, go lead this movement. It's really important.
Love it. And I'll end to say one comment is that my hope is that our discontent for equity and people be made anew through examples of proper stakeholding, engagement, a love for justice, and a shared desire to see all Americans live a vibrant and more meaningful life. We do what we haven't always done, right? We listen to each other, we build relationships, we lean into empathy, we hold ourselves and others accountable, and we take action where we see the faintness of inequities. I want to thank the Snowsports Industries of America for hosting us, and to the participants and the panelists attending today's webinar. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have this discussion with you all, and we look forward to seeing you on the next educational forum. Y'all have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Jason.